Okay, let's begin. So we moved to chapter 16. I'm not sure in different editions of the book, this chapter has different numbers. So it should be chapter 16. If in your book it's some other chapter, it doesn't matter. It's the same text, it's the same content. The role of expectations. Expectations. Besides, that's the expectations theory in the economy. So theories of expectations. Here we enter the realm of revisiting basic paradigm of macroeconomics that we started with. And the basic paradigm is that macroeconomics is a science or pretends or strives to be an exact science in the same sense in which physics and chemistry are exact sciences. Because the scientific goals of macroeconomics are make it an exact science, which means in practice a science whose hypotheses could be tested, checked, verified, empirical. That's the idea from the very beginning, mid-20th century, was the main goal. As a consequence of that, the main approach was to concentrate on things that are measurable and objective. So every science is objective. And that means that the magnitude, the variables that you want to use to explain things are in principle measurable. So those variables are aggregate demand, aggregate supply, CPI, unemployment rate, GDP, and so on and so forth. What all of them have in common is actually that they pertain to the economy as a whole. They are macro variables, macroeconomic variables, pertain to the economy as a whole. They could be empirically measured and statistically compared, correlated. So remember all kinds of things that we just M times V equals P times Q. It's a typical macroeconomic way of thinking. 4 variables, and then you try and understand what is the relationship between those variables. And then if you can measure all of them, then you can check your hypothesis whether this particular equation is correct or whether some particular interpretation of the equation is correct. Whether velocity of circulation is indeed fixed or maybe it's variable. So in principle, at least you can check that, you can verify that by looking at the data, the real world. So then you have the idea of a science as using the measurable aggregates, measurable variables to explain things that you want to understand. To explain a business cycle, to explain sessions, to explain economic growth, to explain the effects of monetary and fiscal policy. You use things that you can measure and that you can correlate together. That was the basic of macroeconomics in the mid-20th century. And that was the basis of all, let's say, all social science in the mid-20th century. The idea was something that I call sometimes physics envy. What is physics envy? That's the idea we're not good enough. Social scientists, economists especially, we're not good enough because we cannot predict things as well as physicists can. We cannot use our theoretical knowledge for practical purposes to the same degree that physicists and engineers and chemists and all natural sciences and applied natural scientists can. They know Newtonian physics, That's everything they needed to put the man on the moon. That's simple Newtonian mechanics. You don't even need general relativistic correction. No, still, use quantum mechanics, we create satellites, computers, and so on. Medical knowledge, we discovered the antibiotics or different types of cures for cancer. Has a real impact, real effect. Nuclear physics, we made an atomic bomb that helped us win the war. And now there was this overwhelming confidence in natural science and technology and belief that they are supremely successful. And then this astonishment, how come that we cannot solve the problems that have to be simpler? If we could win the Second World War, if we could cure tuberculosis, if we could put the man on the moon, what is just smoothing out a business cycle? That should be much easier to do. And then you economists are stupid and incompetent since you cannot solve this problem. And that's the envy, how they can do it and we cannot do it. And then this frantic push throughout the 20th century to make economics more scientific, more precise, more objective. And then you concentrate on the things that you can measure, observe, and try to correlate in the same way that natural scientists do. So this is one of the primary sources, I can tell you now, the primary sources of this push for economic central planning and control. That's social engineering. It's not only that socialism in the 20th century was the popular philosophy, and people usually think that the main reason for this is that Karl Marx became popular and socialist ideas became popular and people accepted them and started rejecting free market capitalism. But that was not the only reason for the popularity of those ideas of economic central planning. Also, there's scientific or scientistic pretensions of social scientists. If you believe that in principle you can control and manage the economy scientifically, and there's just one small step from that to requiring political power for you and other experts to run the things, to run the economy. If there is an expectation that the economy could be scientifically managed, what is more natural than to supplant to some degree the market mechanism with the political, bureaucratic, administrative decision making. So this macroeconomics emerges, classical macroeconomics in the mid 20th century emerges in this atmosphere of this anxious attempts by economists to become more scientific and to control and manage the economy better than they did before. Especially when we take into account the embarrassment of the Great Depression, that monetary and fiscal authorities did nothing, or the common wisdom was that it was a failure to do anything that precipitated the Great Depression and made it so terrible. While on the other hand, Comrade Stalin in the Soviet Union, they didn't have a Great Depression. There was 5 years plans and they're advancing rapidly. It was a common wisdom that socialism did a much better job in economic development than capitalism. Not all macroeconomists believe literally that Stalinist socialism was a more efficient system, but they believe that they may have controlled certain things in their economy more intelligently than we did. So the main idea here is forget about anything subjective, forget about anything psychological, forget about human nature, forget about human motivations and preferences. You don't need any of that in studying macroeconomics. It just messes up your understanding. So you treat human society in a certain sense in the same way in which a physicist treats particles or matter or galaxies. Of course, you know that human beings are different than physical matter, that matter, but for the purposes of developing your science, you treat it as such. Now, then you understand and you treat the economic mechanism as a kind of engine that you can optimize by pushing different buttons and changing the relationship between macroeconomic aggregates. You can change the final outcome in the same way in which you manipulate slightly a mechanical engine, the output of the engine will change. Here, the output of the economy will change depending on how well you finely tune the economy. If finely tuned engine, it works better, it consumes less oil and gasoline, and has better performance and so on. So they literally use the phrase fine tuning. That was the pretension that monetary policy authorities in the mid-20th century had about how to control the macroeconomy. What is fine tuning? That was just quick, fast reactions by monetary policy makers, by the central banks, on the changes in the data, changes in inflation rate, productivity, and so on. If something bad happens, the economy starts to slightly decline, you promptly react by increasing the money supply. If the inflation increases, you increase the interest rates and try to counter this effect. So you finely tune the economy to make those short-term fluctuations as small as possible. Not only that you need to do something if a recession happens, that goes without saying, of course. But even outside of the recession, in a period of positive economic growth, you want to react on a short time scale to prevent any problems and to smooth out, to even out all economic problems. It's to fine tune the economic engine. And monetary policy was used as one of the preferred instruments of that. Okay, you will remember now, last time, that I mentioned one important piece of analysis in Keynesianism, adopted later in Keynesianism. It originated with another economist, but Keynesians adopted it and accepted it later on. That's so-called Phillips curve. And Phillips curve analysis will be the point where this entire paradigm will break. This idea that you can create an economic science by ignoring human subjectivity and psychology and expectations and preferences, and treating society just like some natural scientific system or a technological system or the engine that you can optimize, ignoring what people believe and want to do and expect. It began in 1950s. In 1957, a British economist, Phillips, published a paper in which he analyzed a very long time series of economic data from England about the relationship between wages and inflation, wages and unemployment. Sorry. So he followed, on one hand, wage rates, increase and decrease of average wages in Great Britain from 1863 until 1913, and then he updated it, extended it all the way to 19. So very long time, since 80, 90 years of data. So what happened? Wage rates, changes in wages, and another thing, unemployment statistics. Unemployment rates in the same time period. Annual data, annual statistics. And he discovered the following thing. He looked at the data and said, if I plot this is something interesting and unexpected that I discovered. If I plot the data like this on the horizontal axis, I put in unemployment, and here wage rates, movement of the average wages per hour. And I put one data point for every given year. I match the wage level data with the unemployment rate at that particular year. So I do it for 1863, for 1864, for 1874, all the years for which I do have the data, and I plot them all in this coordinating system. I will get something very strange and very interesting. One data point will be here, the next one here, next one here, next one here, next one here, something like this. All of those data pretty much will cluster like this. It's almost that you can draw a linear curve or some kind of curve like this. This curve is called Phillips curve. The curve showing that there seems to be an inverse relationship between wage inflation, the rate of increase in wages, and unemployment rate. Unemployment rate. It means almost as if there was a trade-off between the increase in wages and in unemployment. Higher the wage rates, higher the level of wages, lower the unemployment rate. And if wage rates decline, we will have an increase in unemployment. It's a very strange thing. So that's the original Phillips curve. If you increase wages, you will reduce the unemployment that way. You wouldn't expect something like that to be true. And it seemed, judging by the British data, that it was the case. Of course, we now know that one of the criteria in order for anything to exist, Americans had to discover it. You know, if Japanese make a good movie, it will become a hit once the Hollywood gets hold of it and buys the scenario and makes an American remake. In science, is the same, and that's the objective fact of life. Phillips curve became a thing in economics when two American economists, Nobel Prize winners, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, published a paper a few years later, I think it was 1961 or 62, in which they looked at the American data, also a long time series of American data, and they changed the vertical axis here. Instead of looking at wage inflation only, they said, let us look at the consumer price index. Let us look at all prices in the economy and see if the same relationship between the prices and the unemployment held for the situation when you compare CPI with the unemployment rather than just the index of wages. And lo and behold, the same thing. And the downward sloping Phillips curve. That means the higher the CPI, lower the unemployment rate. Lower the CPI, which means lower inflation, higher the unemployment rate. It's an inverse relationship. The same method, you plot year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, then to some reasonable approximation, you can draw just a curve for all of these data points and get the Phillips curve. What was the conclusion from this? There are two conclusions, one more superficial and a deeper conclusion. A more superficial one was, macroeconomic policy has to make a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If we have high unemployment, we need to increase the aggregate demand in order to increase productivity, because we see statistically, whatever the mechanism, we don't have to worry now about precise mechanism. We don't know, we may never know, but we look empirically, and it seems to be a very good correlation between low unemployment and high inflation on the one hand, and low inflation and high unemployment. So then, if you have a high unemployment and you want to do better than that, you have to pay the price for that by a higher inflation. You have to increase the aggregate demand, or fiscal, monetary stimulus, whatever you need to do. There seems to be this inescapable, unavoidable inflation-unemployment trade-off. And a deeper conclusion was this philosophical, methodological conclusion. That you can run society successfully, and that you can improve the performance of the economic system by concentrating on some easily measurable and observable magnitudes, and then using the tools of monetary fiscal policy to optimize the statistical relationship between them. Mathematical relationship. That's the way to do economic policy in general. What are the consequences of this? I think that I mentioned last time I mentioned Phillips curve in passing, and also that it broke down in 1970s. And the reason why it failed, why eventually was discredited, was that this statistical relationship didn't hold anymore. In 1970s, we've seen the situations of double-digit inflation rate, very high inflation rate by historical comparison, and also very high unemployment rates at the same time. That's something that couldn't have happened if this were a true scientific law, in the same sense in which Newtonian gravity is correct. I mean, if you say that the gravitational acceleration is 9.81 meters per second squared, it doesn't matter whether you measure it in 1400s Florence or in Bismarck, North Dakota, or whether you are angry or despondent or joyful, or whether you are throwing a stone or a watch or a car from a tower, it's going to be 9.81 meters per second squared, period. No matter what are your ideals, what is the kind of experiment that you do, if you measure it correctly, it's always going to be this. That's the difference between physics and social science. Here, it seems that something that you consider to be an ironclad statistical law, as if gravitational acceleration changed. In 1970s, we observed years in which price level would increase 12%, the unemployment would increase even more so. And when you extend the data set until 2010, 2015, in more years you will have the simultaneous increase in inflation and unemployment than those years in which there will be an inverse relationship, that one of them increases and the other one goes down, as the Phillips curve analysis suggested. So that was the bad news. So this is called, remember, the phenomenon of stagflation, period of low economic growth coupled with high inflation rates, 1970s. Economists coined the term stagflation, stagnation and inflation at the same time. Hence, stagflation. The guy who said the obvious, what is the King's new clothes story. In certain versions, Tsar's clothes, emperor's new clothes. The emperor that didn't have any clothes. We have to reevaluate this whole thing completely. It was Milton Friedman. So what Milton Friedman did, he said, there is no Phillips curve, or there is not one Phillips curve. There are two Phillips curves. There is a short-term and a long-term Phillips curve. The short-term one may look like this, but in the long run, there is no inflation, unemployment. In the long run, the only things that matter are real productivity of your economy, real factors. such as technological productivity, quality of the labor force, the number of workers that you have, the level of scientific knowledge that you have, and so on. So this policy that people dream, right, about, that you have a Phillips curve here, that's your Phillips curve, and you have different, in type, here is the CPI, and here is the unemployment rate. You have some points A, B, C, D, E, and now your role as a policymaker is to choose which one of those points you want to be on. It's always a trade-off. You can go from C to B, but you know that you do that. The CPI is going to increase, but the unemployment rate is going to fall, and vice versa. You can go down, but it's always the same relationship. He said, oh, that's not the case anymore. Because the basic relationship, the basic trade-off is broken, so this is not the whole story. In the long run, this doesn't work. What Friedman proposed, in addition, so he said that he introduced first one new theoretical concept pertaining to unemployment. That is natural rate of unemployment. And he defined it as a rate of unemployment, let's call it UR, which is consistent with zero inflation. Another way of putting it would be this is consistent with only the real factors influencing GDP or production. Q. Remember Q. Quantity of goods and services. That's a natural rate of unemployment. So now, what is the problem according to Friedman, with all these attempts to finely tune the economy and to always trade inflation off against the unemployment rate? The role of expectations. The reason why your statistical correlations break down is that people have different expectations about the future, and that their expectations do not match reality always. And that what kind of results you will face eventually will be determined by how correct expectations people have, how correct predictions people make about the future. So Friedman introduces here, center stage, exactly what economists wanted to avoid and to eliminate from economics for 34 years before him. Subjective psychological elements. Go away, we don't want that. We want stuff that could be measured, that is objective, scientific. Now you say we cannot understand economic life scientifically if we don't introduce expectations and subjective preferences, things that are very difficult to measure and objectivize and check. That's exactly what. So monetary policy is ineffective because people's expectations may mess it up. Remember this basic framework. Productivity on the horizontal axis, inflation on the vertical axis. You have a longer aggregate supply curve here. So let's say that this is your initial, this is aggregate demand 1, this is short-term aggregate supply. So Friedman would say that ideally you would like to increase to get to this point here. Point 1 is the initial equilibrium. Here you want to increase your production. Temporarily, basically. At a price of higher inflation. It's the original, this is BI1, which is lower. Here, inflation rate increases. And now Friedman says, this makes sense. This can work only, this is the key, only if we expect inflationary expectations that people have. Their expectation how high the inflation rate will be in the next year, in the next 6 months, is incorrect. Those expectations are incorrect. If they're correct, nothing will change. Production will not increase because if people expect inflation rate to be 4%, everybody expects inflation rate to be 4%. And inflation rate indeed eventually ends up being 4%. So what's going to happen? People will make contracts, rate contracts, indexed to inflation. We'll say it will increase 4% because all of us expect inflation rate to be 4%. So then the trade unions and workers will ask for this increment of 4% over the period over which the rate contracts are fixed. If this anticipation is correct, then the prices will increase 4%, so all prices will increase at the same rate, but no new production will take place. See, because the wage rates will be higher, wages will increase exactly to the degree that the selling prices will increase. The cost will increase 4%, revenue will increase 4%, production will not increase. For production to increase, the rate of growth of revenue has to exceed the rate of growth of costs. If they rise or fall in sync, nothing will happen. 4% increase in revenue, 4% increase in wage cost, labor cost, quantity of goods and services has increased. This will not happen here. So Friedman says, if people correctly anticipate the effects of inflation, monetary policies cannot do anything. He said, the reason why this usually works in the short run is that people have incorrect anticipations of future inflation rates. So imagine now that instead of 4%, everybody believes that the inflation rate over the next year will be 2%. And you don't know that, actually. You don't know how high the inflation rate will be. So we make wage contracts by assuming 2% increase in costs of living, in prices of everything. We say that wages are going to increase 2% next year in order to account for the expected inflation of consumer prices. And then it turns out that after 1 year, this increase in consumer prices will be 4%. So what will be happening here is that the employers will face an increased demand for their products, for their goods and services. The increase in demand will be spurred by temporary boost in money supply, but they don't know that. You don't know when your inventories decline and the demand for your good increases, you don't know at that moment whether the demand for your good increased vis-a-vis other goods, or just the money supply increased the demand for all goods, or some combination. The only thing that you objectively know as an entrepreneur is that the demand for your goods increased and you can make more money by producing more goods. As simple as that. Now, what you do when you can produce and sell more goods profitably, you employ more people. You accept more workers. What will be the wages which they work? Those would be the wages that take into account the 2% expectations in inflation rate. So those wages will be prevailing wages right now. So now you have an increase in revenue at the pace of 4% on average per year, and you have an increase in labor costs 2% per year. Of course, after a year, you will see the two things will happen. The profit rates will slightly increase, but what's going to happen to the standard of living of workers? Are they going to be happy when they discover what happened to them? Oh, not at all. They will learn that their nominal income went up 2%, but their cost of living went up 4%. They're also, what are they going to do? The trade unions and the workers will now say, aha, it was 4%. For the next period, we're going to ask for a higher raise, depending on what the expectation is. For the next year, we're going to ask for 4 or 5 or 6%. Let's say that Friedman says people have adaptive expectations. That means we make mistakes, we guess, very commonly we incorrectly guess, and once we learn that we make a mistake, we correct ourselves. We adapt to the situation. So in this particular case, adaptive expectations would require people to ask for 4%. Increasing wages for the next year. Now you know that inflation increased in the past 4%. You project what happened in the past to the future. I don't want to get robbed once again. I now ask for 4% increase. Now, what is your choice now as a policy maker? You can say, okay, I'm going to increase 4%. Money supply. What's going to happen then? Nothing. Just as in the previous case, remember. Nobody does anything because the rate of growth of revenue goes hand in hand with rate of growth in costs. Production doesn't increase. But if you want to push through a monetary stimulus to affect the economy this way, you have to increase the real rate of inflation as compared to the expected one. The expected one is now 4%, you have to go to 6%. And what's going to happen then? First, it's going to increase. The wages are going to increase by 4%, revenue by 6%. Production will increase temporarily, but what's going to happen next? Once this is discovered, people will ask for higher wages once again, and as they ask for higher wages, the productivity will decline once again. So the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. And we will end up with this here. Higher prices and lower productivity. So now people will ask them for even higher wages. Now it was 6%. Let us now for 6% increase in the next period. And then you want to stimulate it by creating 8% inflation. You move the aggregate demand curve once again. And the same process all over again. And this is called, in theory, the wage price spiral. That consumer prices and wages are racing the race. Which one is going to increase more? You have an increase in price inflation, prompting trade union demands for higher wages. And higher wages reduce productivity of the economy, prompting more calls for monetary stimulus by the central bank that will increase the money prices still further. Further increase in money prices will prompt further demands for higher wages in order to pay for the higher cost of living, and so on. Like in a spiral, it goes up and up and up. It's called wage price spiral. So then eventually what you need, what you have two options here. Either to go into hyperinflation, ever increasing rate of inflation, and try to break the resistance of those wages. You have to try and deceive people all the time. You see, what is the precondition of a successful monetary policy is that you succeed in deceiving people, in creating false expectations. Because if people expect 4% inflation and you deliver 4% inflation, nothing happens. In order for this temporary stimulus to work, you will have to create a higher rate of price increase than it is expected. So you can draw the curve, the Phillips curve that summarizes the whole process here. We have that in your book as well, in a relatively simple fashion. So here you have CPI. CPI, here you have unemployment rate. So this is your long-term Phillips curve. Which means that the natural unemployment rate is fixed. It's whatever it is, dictated by technological progress. Whatever. And you have now a Phillips curve, number one. This is your equilibrium here, where your short-term unemployment rate equals long-term unemployment rate. This is the same thing as the short-run aggregate supply and the long-run aggregate supply. It's just one and the same thing looked from two different points of view. Because you remember, that the long-run aggregate supply curve just measures production. And the long-run aggregate supply curve is characterized by the level of output which is consistent with the natural unemployment rate. So now you try to do your old magic that you move along the given Phillips curve from one point to another. Let's say here you want to move to point 2. You want to lower the unemployment rate. This is this move here from unemployment from the quantity of production consistent with natural unemployment, long-run productivity of the economy along the long-run supply curve to this point here. This is the same movement as this one here. From natural unemployment rate, you want to create lower unemployment than the natural one. That's the idea. But now you're not going to be able to create it because you're going to create a new short-run Phillips curve. If the expectations of inflation are lower than the realized inflation rate, you will have a new Phillips curve here. And you will end up at this point here with the same level of unemployment and with the even higher level of inflation. So the key discovery of Friedman was that you cannot simplify economics in such a way as to eliminate all subjective elements. From this point on, economists realize that we will see that it gets even more radical later on. On Friday, we will see an even more radical school of thought pertaining to expectations. An attempt ensued to find micro foundations for macroeconomics, which means to explain and understand macroeconomics taking into account subjective factors such as utility, psychology, and expectations and preferences and so on. to discover a way of thinking about the macroeconomy that takes into account subjective preferences. And as I said, that is bad news for macroeconomists because that goes against everything that they believe before. It makes this scientific pretense of economics much more difficult to sustain. Because you have to introduce and to model things that are impossible or very difficult to measure and quantify. Expectation, preferences, utility, psychological factors. Very difficult to objectively measure, especially to intersubjectively measure and compare my expectations versus your expectations, my preferences versus your preferences. And it seems that you have to understand all that and to include into macroeconomic models to understand the whole picture. So that's the problem that we are addressing in the end of the course. All those micro foundations of macroeconomics. Any final questions? Anything? Yes, see you on Friday. Yeah, on Wednesday. Oh, sorry, on Wednesday.
We're going to my channel.